The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this morning's Toolbox Talk. My name is Sean Frey, and I will be your organizer for this morning. Guys, as it is only a 30-minute session, I am going to keep this short and simply summarize it all by saying, if you guys have any questions whatsoever, just go ahead and post it in the questions tab. If it is a question on the service, I will go ahead and answer it as soon as I can. If it is a question on the material itself of the webinar, we will go ahead and leave it for Chris at the end of the webinar. All right, guys, I hope everyone enjoys the session, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Chris. Chris, are you there?
Yes, thank you very much, Sean, and a very warm welcome from this cold Johannesburg to all our attendees this morning. Thank you once again for taking your time off to hear this Toolbox Talk based on different subjects, and as always, brought and sponsored by FEM and IOPSA. It is presented by myself, Chris, from OHSS Consulting, and don't forget that you do get one CPD credit from SAOSH. We did have a question about the SAOSH credits. Please remember that you just need to log into your own SAOSH membership area, and wherever you upload your previous credits, you do it exactly the same way with this Toolbox Talk. Basically putting in the same date and time and just putting out FEM Toolbox Talk, and you will be accredited with that one CPD point. So I do hope that answers some of the questions. We did have quite a few questions from last week based on some respirators and hearing protection, and I did get back to many of you that emailed me. There might still be one or two. There was a lot of emails that came through, but please don't fret if I haven't emailed you yet. It will still be coming through to you. I do appreciate that. Thank you very, very much for those emails, comments, suggestions, and we had some brilliant suggestions over the past week. I've actually compiled a little PDF document on some of those suggestions, especially on hearing protection and the rule of thumb that came out quite a few times. So I would really like to share that with everybody, if you don't mind. There is another question that I did not answer as yet because I'm still getting some information, and that is about the rip stitch clothing, your double stitch, your 3-stitch, and all of that with the PPE side. I will get back to you guys as soon as I have concrete or proper information. I am getting various information, and I just want to make sure I give you guys the right information that I find out there. I really just don't want to give you anything that I find. So I hope that you guys keep asking these questions, and I really do appreciate them. I'm learning a lot myself. This morning's Toolbox Talk is on confined spaces. Now, as we mentioned last week, we are going to have case studies, if I can find them, specifically from our own industry. Wherever it is possible, I will look for a case study from South Africa, just to make it more pertinent to ourselves and the industry that we are working in. Since IOPSA is really focusing on you guys as plumbers, and in fact all of you out there that are doing very dangerous or hazardous work in various environments, some of the suggestions that they give me is to really bring across to you how important it is to understand the different hazards and risks that are involved in your particular type of industry. So for any of you who are working in confined spaces, we are going to go through the basics of a confined space and what you need to have. And then instead of the know-how or the did you know section that I normally have in my Toolbox Talks, I've got a little quiz that we're going to go through. It's a couple of questions, just 10 questions. I'll pop the question onto the presentation. It'll be a true or false or a multiple choice. You can go ahead and write them down, just your answers, and then we're going to answer them straight after we've done the question. And let's see how many you got right or wrong. And then from there, we can start assisting you with understanding more about confined spaces. So I hope you guys enjoyed this morning. And once again, as Sean mentioned, send through those comments or questions or any queries you have, or something particular that you would like to hear during these Toolbox Talks. But one thing that we must remember about confined spaces, any tragedies that happen in a confined space claim many, many lives. And that is because a lot of people do not know or understand the dangers and hazards involved in a confined space. Well, what are the dangers? First of all, the definition of a confined space is an area which is the right size and shape to allow us to actually enter into it, but it has limited entrances and exits, making it very difficult for us to strategize and make sure that we always are close enough to an entrance and exit, making it very dangerous in an evacuation procedure. And thus it's important to make sure that it is not designed for continuous occupancy. So please remember, these spaces, the confined spaces, are intended for temporary human use. And these could be for things such as maintenance, repairs, or tests. But really, we want to understand why it is that it is only a temporary amount of time that we must spend in these confined spaces. Now, when we say temporary, we are not saying just for a couple of days at a time out of the month. We are speaking about only a few hours in a day, if that. So it's not during the month of time, it's actually during the intended day of time for that task. And then knowing the dangers will assist us in preparing a proper plan, making sure that we have the correct procedures in place to ensure that the hazards that are involved in actually entering or exiting in a confined space does not overcome us. So maybe you have a job that requires you to enter a confined space. Well, for one thing, you must have extensive training. Now, notice I put there extensive training and not just training. And this is because a lot of companies out there are offering training on confined spaces. I myself have been to these 2 to 3 day courses over the past 10 years in health and safety. These little short courses that help us to understand a little bit of confined spaces are not sufficient enough for us to actually understand the dangers. And I'm not knocking any of the training companies. They are doing what is required of them according to the unit standard. However, the unit standard is not covering each and every aspect of our specific scope of work. And that is why I'd like to encourage you to have additional training on top of these short courses that you are doing. You do not need to go to an accredited training provider. It can just be on-the-job type of training, or even doing a little bit of research yourself on the internet according to your specific scope and your specific industry. And that is just so that you understand the actual dangers and hazards that are involving yourself and your task when entering a confined space. So it's very good to have these short course trainings. In fact, if you are going for an entire course on confined spaces, well done. It's very good to have this. But don't stop the training there once you've got a certificate to say that you've attended a course. Continue with that training, make it extensive, and that really is going to help us to prevent so many of the deaths that are claiming lives nowadays because of the dangers of confined spaces. The second thing that a confined space entry must have is carefully written policies. These policies outline the exact target or objective of ensuring persons who are working in a confined space are safe. Not only are they safe, but it outlines the actions to be taken when entering, exiting, or even rescuing someone in a confined space. So it really is a carefully written, and we're not saying that every other policy is not carefully written, but we have to understand that this is an extremely high hazard or a higher hazard job than most others. In fact, we put this very much on the level of working at heights or working with dangerous machinery. It's one of the top hazards that are actually claiming so many lives that it is very important to always have this continual training or continual monitoring and review plans of any policies and procedures that we have. The third very, very important thing for a confined space is specialized equipment. And this is really where the cost comes in. And many people complain about the cost of such equipment. But remember, when we in the industry weigh it up against the cost of a life, really, we always want to ensure that we have a good budget to have specialized equipment. And this equipment that we are talking about are not just the things as the PPE that you should be wearing and the respirators. It's actually the monitoring tools that you need for testing atmospheres, to check the toxic gases that are involved, and to make sure that these are not at a dangerous level that it could cost somebody their life. Remember, a respirator, and these are some of the things that we sent out last week, that entire PDF document that we got from FEM helped us to understand the different types of respirators that we have out there, and the certain types of toxic atmospheres that we are finding in confined spaces. Some of these very good respirators actually do not clean out all those particles, or they only do it for a certain amount of time before you need to change all of those respirator modules. So what we are asking is to make an informed decision by doing research, proper planning, and ensure the equipment that you're using is not just cheap enough for you to do the job, because obviously we're always working on a budget, but that it is effective enough for continual use within that confined space. So it really takes some good planning. So it is very important for all of us, whether you are entering a confined space, whether you are writing the procedures of a confined space, and especially if you are actually working in a confined space, to know about the dangers of these spaces. In fact, we don't just want you to have the knowledge. We want you to be able to recognize the dangers, both when you are on the job as well as being off the job. And that's where toolbox talks like this, additional training that you are going to go on, and more research into the dangers of confined space will help you to understand why it is so dangerous and why we need these three things: extensive training, careful written policies, as well as specialized equipment. Now, most confined spaces have very poor natural ventilation, and this basically allows toxic or flammable gases to build up. And what we end up having now is a hazardous atmosphere. If you take a look at the bottom right-hand corner, just using one type of confined space, and this is a sewer, once you enter into a manhole, you are exposed to these toxic chemicals almost immediately. But you will notice the different types of toxic gases that make up some of this atmosphere. First of all, with your lightest chemical at the moment, which is methane gas that starts seeping and going right to the top, you are, as you are climbing down, exposed to this methane instantly. You are then being exposed to carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide actually can engulf an entire space. For one thing, carbon monoxide can be found at the top, bottom, or even middle, and can be present in all spaces of a confined space. And this is really one of those toxic gases that engulf a lot of people in a confined space. You then get things like hydrogen sulfide, propane, gasoline, and eventually the actual sewer water. And those sewer gases are constantly in the environment. Now, these are all exposures to hazardous toxic substances before you've even started to do any work in that sewer. So please remember that as soon as you've entered, you are already exposed to the hazards. It's not when you've started working. So that is why it is very important to make sure that we understand all hazards that are involved with entering, working in, and exiting a confined space. Now, that's not the only hazards in a confined space. There are other things, as you notice there in point 2, and this could be moving machinery, different types of liquids. As you see there, the sewer water contains a lot of biological hazards. For some of us that are allergic to sewer water, which I'm sure many of us are, we want to make sure none of this gets onto us, especially into us, and really this becomes a hazardous liquid for us to work in. There can also be other materials which can cause suffocation or entrapment. So once again, a good, proper, planned procedure, a understanding of the hazards is not just important, but it is vital that we have this before entering or working in a confined space. So are you at risk because of your specific task that you are performing? The description of confined spaces that we are busy speaking about are very varied. And when we say confined space, it covers a multiple of confined spaces. So we'd like to ask you, what type of spaces are you working in? And did you perhaps know that it could be classified as a confined space? And these things could be manholes, sewers, trenches, excavations, silos, hoppers, chimneys, and tunnels, among a lot of others, are all included in that description of confined spaces and requires certain procedures before working in that space. So perhaps if you look at some of these, you might recognize an environment that you are currently working in that you perhaps did not know was a confined space. Well, now good planning and proper procedures need to be implemented. Maybe there's something that I have not touched on and you would like to share your own experiences of some confined spaces, or perhaps you have questions on these specific ones. I know many speaking about excavations. Please remember, an excavation must reach a certain criteria to become a confined space. So it's not all excavations, but it is there because some excavations do become a confined space when it reaches the right depth, and especially when we have gone into a type of environment where it is known for hazardous toxic substances within the soils or ground. So if you have any questions, once again, my email is there. You are always welcome to send through those questions. And I do promise, it might take me a little bit of time sometimes, but I will get back to you on your questions. So here are some of the things, and we're going to go through some of the things that you must have for a confined space entry program. So these are just the basic things that you must have. And this is aside from your risk assessments, your rescue plans, your emergency evacuations, and all these other things that you must have. We are talking about just the basics of, once you have developed your entire health and safety system around your scope of confined space entry or confined space work, these are the basics that you must have before entering or exiting that confined space. For one, that confined space must be identified. Once it is identified, an entry permit system to give you specific detailed written permission before you enter a confined space must be put in place. And there's a type of entry permit that you see on the bottom right-hand corner. The atmosphere must be tested by a qualified and trained person before and during entry. In fact, depending on the amount of time that you're going to be working in that confined space, it needs to periodically be inspected as well for different types of toxic gases. This is really where your training, your policies and procedures, as well as your specialized equipment is all coming into play. And now we can see how we are supposed to use this in an entry program for confined spaces. A few other things is to ensure that the atmosphere in which we are working in, because it could be dangerous, must always be ventilated or purged with air. And there on the bottom, you can actually see the different types or the wrong and right way of making sure you get fresh air into that confined space. We do not want to recirculate everything that we are taking out. So please make sure that the setup of pumping oxygen into that confined space is the correct way of purging or ventilating that atmosphere. Remember, we never want to suck any toxic fumes out or try and say that we want to ventilate the space by sucking the air out and sucking the toxic fumes. Basically, what you're doing is you're also sucking out all the oxygen and thus making it even more dangerous. What you want to do is blow air in, blow fresh air in continually, and what this does is it disperses all of these other hazardous chemical substances, and hopefully this can purge it out to make sure that it becomes less hazardous than when you have started. Any other hazards, as we mentioned, moving machinery, things like that, hazardous waters or liquids, all of this must also be isolated or mitigated before we can start working. And this would require, once again, good planning, proper policies and procedures. In fact, it could even be a lockout, tag out system that we must implement for some electrical circuits, steam sources, or even that mechanical machinery that we perhaps are using in that confined space. So now we are starting to see a pattern of how much we need to know and the information that goes in before we actually are required to enter a confined space. So for some of you who may be working in that confined space, you see all these policies and procedures that you must go through, these documents you must sign, and a whole lot of tests and things that you have to do. And you think, wow, what a schlep. It's really, takes half the day to do this and then only half the day to be able to work. But now we can actually see the need and the necessity for having a program like this. And that is so that we can prevent a loss of life. In fact, it's the prevention of your loss of life. That's really where we are going with this. And then another thing is also to wear the correct PPE. So any worker, any employee who enters the confined space must wear an appropriate respirator. He must also wear a lifeline that is attached to a lifting device outside the confined space. And this is only in certain confined spaces. But please remember, it is necessary in a rescue procedure, specifically in a manhole. And that is because if the person is unconscious or gets passed out because of the hazardous toxic substances, do not try and jump in. That is why that lifeline is there, where you can hoist the person up to fresh air instead of putting your own life in danger and possibly going in yourself and being engulfed by these toxic substances. And then anybody who is going to be performing a rescue must be trained and properly equipped. These are attendants and supervisors so that they can ensure an effective rescue procedure, and the loss of life will then be minimized. So in any situation, we want to encourage you to please follow the safe working procedures and safe operating procedures that are outlined in that policy for working in confined spaces. In potentially explosive atmospheres, and this is also with a high buildup of methane, please remember all sources of ignition must be removed and all other safe working practices have to be followed. So a confined space tragedy, as we mentioned in the beginning, claims many lives. And here's a small case study of someone who had no idea of what they were getting themselves into. A farmer who entered into a silo where toxic gas was present. He suffocated and died. The farmer's son, who was unaware of the dangers that were in that silo, tried to save him, and he also died. A friend then also entered the silo to save him, and he also died. 3 lives just because of the incorrect policies and procedures for entering a confined space. The dangers are real. These chain reaction tragedies is often repeated in all types of confined spaces, not just silos. And over half of the confined space victims were attempting to rescue someone else when they died, unaware of the dangers that were awaiting them, because we could not see it, and many times we could not smell it, because the amount of toxic fumes that hit us could take the smell away, and all of a sudden we are engulfed and have no ability to be able to rescue ourselves or someone else. So guys, it is very dangerous. Know the particular confined space hazard in your workplace according to your scope and follow all of the safety procedures. Well, now we come to the Did You Know section, or as we are going to do it today, the quiz part, to see how much you know about confined spaces. So let's start with question number 1. People trying to rescue others from confined spaces often die themselves in the process. Would you say that that is true or false? Well, if you've written down your answer, here is the answer now. People trying to rescue others from a confined space often die themselves in the process. That is true. Question 2. Confined space entry requires A. Extensive training, B. Careful written policies, C. Specialized equipment, or D. All of the above. Well, if you answered D, all of the above, you would be correct. We must have each one of these, not just one of or 2 of. All 3 are required. Question 3. Confined spaces are designed for continuous occupancy. So it means we can spend lots of time in a confined space. True or false? Well, of course, the answer is false. These are temporary working environments. A confined space may have poor natural ventilation, allowing toxic or flammable gases to build up. True or false? Well, if you answered true, you would be correct. These are very hazardous atmospheres, and every hazard and known toxic environment must be made aware to us so that we understand the hazards of that confined space. An entry permit system that must be in place for a confined space will give you A, the right to take the day off, B, specific detailed permission before you enter a confined space, and C, none of the above. Well, hopefully you answered B. If you didn't, please make sure we do have it in place, these specific detailed written permissions and entry permits before entering a confined space. Question 6. Confined spaces have limited entrances and exits. Well, if we remember the definition of a confined space, that would be true. And this makes it very difficult for us to ensure an effective evacuation program. Thus, extensive research into that must be done. So question 7, we're coming to the end here. If you see another worker lying unconscious in a confined space, what must you do? A, rush in and help. B, tell a supervisor. C, keep on working. Or D, none of the above. Well, hopefully you've answered B, tell a supervisor. Yes, if he's laying unconscious, call the supervisor, ensure the emergency evacuation program is in place, and rescue that person without the cost of additional lives. Moving machinery, temperature extremes, and slippery surfaces are some other potential hazards associated with entering a confined space. True or false? Well, we did mention earlier that there are more hazards in a confined space. So it is true that moving machinery, temperature extremes, and slippery surfaces could be other potential sources of hazards in that confined space. The last two questions. What are some examples of confined spaces? A, kitchens. B, manholes, sewers, and excavations. C, vessels, silos, and cisterns. Or D, both B and C. Well, that was a pretty easy one. We did go through all the different types of confined spaces that we currently know, but there are many more. Maybe you are working in a confined space and did not know it. So please drop us a mail and tell us what type of environment you are working in so we can see if it is classified a confined space. The last question, respiratory equipment and lifelines are components of a confined space entry program. So do we need specialized equipment? True or false? Well, it is true. We do need specialized equipment before entering or exiting a confined space. Well, that's all from me this morning, guys. Thank you very much for joining us. And on behalf of FEM and our APSA, we hope you have a super safe week. We look forward to seeing you next week when you log in at the same time for the next topic, getting into a little bit of the winter chill. How can we work safely in this environment? What are the hazards? And please remember to keep those questions, comments, or suggestions coming. Even if you have criticism, I won't take it personally. I appreciate every comment that you send through. So for myself, Chris at OHSS Consulting, thank you very much for joining us this morning. And I'm going to hand it over back to you, Sean.
Perfect, Chris. We do have a couple of questions before we do end off the session. The first question reads, if an employee suffers from claustrophobia, may an employer force him to enter the area?
Well, no, not at all. Please remember you do have to undergo a psychological questionnaire, and this is based on your medical certificate of fitness. And this psychological questionnaire for working in heights or confined spaces, where the doctor will ask you, is there any reason why you cannot work in this specific environment? You will then outline what your reasons are. Claustrophobia is a known situation or condition, and since this is a very difficult one, you do need to consult your doctor, but please make sure it is on your medical certificate of fitness. But remember, the law does state that you are allowed to say no to a dangerous working environment, especially if you have a medical reason not to perform that work. Thanks, Sean.
Perfect. The second question reads, hi, gasoline in a sewer is from general spillage.
Yeah, that's more of a comment, more than a question. And yes, you would be correct. A lot of times it is because of general spillage. It also depends on the type of environment that you are working on. Oftentimes we might be in an environment where gasoline or other different types of explosive gases or materials are actually already present in that soil. So that's why if we are going to be digging quite low, we have to get soil samples and all of that type of thing to make sure that the environment that we are working in is identified correctly.
Perfect. The third question for this morning reads, would working in a ceiling be considered a confined space? If so, would you still require documentation?
So if we take a look at the actual definition of a confined space, you would notice that the atmosphere is very dangerous. This is correct in a ceiling, but you do have a lot of natural ventilation in a ceiling. So what we are going to suggest to you is making sure that within that ceiling, there's not going to be toxic buildup of hazardous substances such as methane and things like that. But it also depends on where that ceiling is. For those of you who are going to be installing geysers and things like that in a personal home, well, then a ceiling does not contain those hazardous chemical substances, but you do still need to look out for other things, such as rat feces or bird feces, things like that, things that make it biologically very dangerous. So I would suggest that you still have a very good entry or exit permit because it only has one entrance or one exit, but it is not classified as an actual confined space according to the law.
Perfect. And that is all of the questions we have this morning. Would you like to say a few final words?
Yeah, just thank you very much for all those questions, and thank you to you, Sean, for always being there at the back end. We really appreciate it. I don't think you get enough recognition from that. And to all of our sponsors, as well as Sayosh for making this a CPD point, we thank you very much on behalf of everybody that's listening. I'm sure I can do that, to say thank you for bringing this about. These Toolbox Talks are very informative, and we really do appreciate them.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us, guys. Apologies, Chris. It does look like we have just gotten one more question.
Sure.
So just before I do end off the session, I'm just going to give it over to you. In the case of new underground tanks, do you still need to test the air?
Definitely. The air must always be tested if it is a confined space, whether you feel it has hazardous chemicals or not. And that is because anything could have happened within a few minutes to a couple of hours of those tanks being installed. So a very good or very quick check on the type of atmosphere that you are finding, the amount of oxygen in that space, and really this can be done with very cheap equipment that you can find out there. Some guys have got some very decent stuff for a very good price, and this will allow you to ensure you have enough oxygen in that confined space to be able to work.
Perfect. Then, guys, I am going to go and end off the webinar as we do not have any more questions. So thanks so much for joining us this morning. Thanks, Chris, for actually presenting this, because I do know that it takes the half an hour on a Tuesday, but it also takes time to prep, guys. So thanks, Chris. And thanks again, guys, for joining us, and I hope to see everyone again same time next week. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sean. Cheers.